The snow had been falling for hours. Not the soft, gentle kind that makes the world look peaceful. This was the heavy, relentless kind that swallowed roads, buried sidewalks, and turned every streetlight into a hazy white glow in the storm. The wind howled down the empty street like something alive, pushing waves of snow across the pavement. And at the corner of Maple Street and 3rd Avenue, under a flickering bus stop light, a woman stood alone. Her name was Margaret Hale, and that night she was 61 years old. She pulled her thin wool coat tighter around her shoulders, but it didn't help much. The wind slipped through every seam like icy fingers. Her gloves were worn at the fingertips, and the cold had already turned her hands stiff and pale. Margaret shifted her weight from one foot to the other, trying to keep warm. The bus was late. Very late. She glanced down the empty road again, squinting through the storm. Nothing. Just swirling snow and darkness. Of course, she murmured quietly to herself, her breath turning to fog in the freezing air. Tonight of all nights. The truth was, Margaret probably shouldn't have been out in weather like this at all. But life had a way of ignoring what people should do. 3 hours earlier, she had been cleaning the offices on the 4th floor of a small insurance building downtown. It wasn't glamorous work, scrubbing desks, emptying trash cans, wiping fingerprints off glass doors, but it paid enough to keep the lights on in her small apartment. Most nights she finished around 8. Tonight the storm had slowed everything down. By the time she finally clocked out, the buses were already running behind schedule. Margaret adjusted the strap of her purse and hugged it closer to her side. Inside that purse was everything she had. Her bus pass. A small packet of tissues. Her apartment keys. And a single folded bill. $20. Her last $20 until payday. She had counted it twice earlier that evening while sitting in the break room under the buzzing fluorescent lights. $20. That money was supposed to buy groceries tomorrow. A loaf of bread. Maybe eggs if they were on sale. And a small carton of soup she liked, the kind that warmed your hands while you ate it. Nothing fancy. But enough. Margaret wasn't the kind of person who complained about life. Hard years had taught her something important, complaining rarely changed anything. She had lost her husband, Daniel, 6 winters ago to a sudden heart attack. One moment they were drinking coffee together in the kitchen. The next moment everything had changed. After that, the house had been too big. Too quiet. Too expensive. So she sold it. Now she lived in a modest apartment above a small laundromat across town. It wasn't the life she once imagined, but it was a life she had learned to carry with quiet dignity. The wind gusted again, blowing snow across the bus shelter. Margaret turned her face away from the storm. The digital display above the bus stop flickered weakly. Bus 17, delayed. She sighed. Of course it was. For a moment she considered walking the rest of the way home. But that would take nearly an hour in this weather. At her age, that wasn't the smartest decision. So she waited. The city around her felt strangely silent. Most people had already gone home hours ago. Cars were rare now. The only sound was the wind scraping snow across the empty road. Margaret rubbed her gloved hands together. Then she heard something. At first it was faint. Almost lost beneath the storm. Footsteps. Crunching through the snow. She turned slowly. Through the swirling white, a figure was approaching from the far end of the sidewalk. A man. He moved unevenly, like someone fighting the wind with every step. As he drew closer, the dim bus stop light revealed more details. He was tall. Maybe in his late 40s. His dark coat was dusted with snow, and his hair was damp, clinging slightly to his forehead. He looked like someone who had been walking outside for a long time. Too long. When he reached the shelter, he stopped just outside the light. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The storm howled around them. Margaret noticed something immediately. The man looked exhausted. Not just tired. Desperate. His breathing was heavy, and his hands trembled slightly as he rubbed them together for warmth. He glanced down the empty road, then back toward her. For a few seconds, it seemed like he was deciding whether or not to say something. Finally, he stepped a little closer. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was rough from the cold. Margaret looked up at him. "Yes?" The man hesitated again. Then he spoke the words that would change both of their lives. "I'm really sorry to bother you," he said, "but could you help me?" For a moment, Margaret didn't answer. The wind pushed another wave of snow past the bus shelter, rattling the thin metal frame. The dim light above them flickered once, then steadied again. Margaret studied the man carefully. Years of living alone had taught her something important: you learn to read people quickly. The man standing in front of her looked like someone who had been through a rough night. His coat was good quality, far better than the kind Margaret owned, but it was covered in snow and damp at the shoulders. His shoes were soaked. His face had the pale, strained look of someone who had been out in the cold for too long. Still, appearances could be deceiving. Margaret kept her voice calm. "What kind of help do you need?" she asked. The man exhaled slowly, as if relieved she hadn't simply turned away. "My car broke down about 2 miles from here," he explained, nodding back toward the dark street behind him. "I was trying to make it to the gas station on Elm Street, but I didn't realize how bad the storm had gotten." He rubbed his hands together again, trying to warm them. "I tried calling for a tow truck, but my phone died about an hour ago." Margaret listened quietly. The man glanced toward the road, where the storm continued to swallow everything in white. "There's a taxi company that still runs during storms," he continued. "I saw one pass earlier, but well." He hesitated again. Margaret noticed the hesitation. "What is it?" she asked. The man gave a small, embarrassed smile. "I left my wallet in the car." For a second, the only sound was the wind. Margaret felt something inside her tighten slightly. Of all the stories someone could tell. Still, the man didn't look like he was lying. In fact, he looked almost uncomfortable asking. "I know how this sounds," he said quickly. "And I wouldn't ask if I had any other option." Snow had started collecting in his hair again. "If I could just get enough for a taxi," he added, "I could get back to my car and pay you back tomorrow. I promise." Margaret didn't respond immediately. Instead, she slowly reached down and placed her purse on the small metal bench inside the shelter. The zipper slid open with a soft sound. Inside, her fingers brushed past the tissues, her bus pass, her keys. Then they stopped. The folded bill. $20. Her last $20. Margaret held it between her fingers but didn't pull it out yet. She could already feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. If she gave the money away, tomorrow would be difficult. Very difficult. She had carefully planned her groceries around that money. Bread. Eggs. Soup. Without it, she might have to wait several days before she could buy anything else. At her age, skipping meals wasn't something she could do lightly. Margaret closed her eyes for just a moment. A memory surfaced quietly in her mind. Daniel. Her husband. He had always been the generous one. Whenever someone needed help, neighbors, coworkers, strangers, Daniel had a habit of stepping forward without hesitation. Once, years ago, Margaret had asked him why. He had simply smiled and said something she never forgot. "You never know when someone's worst day might cross your path." She opened her eyes again. The man was still standing there, looking uncomfortable, almost apologetic for asking. He hadn't stepped closer. He hadn't pressured her. He simply waited. Snow continued falling around them. Margaret finally spoke. "How long have you been out here?" she asked. The man glanced up at the sky briefly. Maybe an hour, maybe a little longer. His voice had started to shake slightly. The cold was getting to him. Margaret noticed something else now. His hands were trembling more than before. Not dramatically, but enough. She had seen that kind of shaking before. The kind that comes when a person has been exposed to cold too long. Margaret slowly pulled the bill from her purse. The green paper looked strangely fragile under the bus stop light. $20. Enough to solve the man's problem. Enough to create one for her. She stared at it for a long second. Then she looked up at him. You said a taxi would get you back to your car, she asked. Yes, the man replied quickly. It's not far. Just past Elm Street. Margaret nodded slowly. Her fingers tightened slightly around the bill. Inside her chest, two thoughts battled each other. You can't afford this. But what if he really needs help? The wind howled again. Finally, Margaret made her decision. She stepped forward and held out the money. Here, she said quietly. The man blinked in surprise. No, I couldn't. You said you needed a taxi, Margaret interrupted gently. He stared at the bill for a moment like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. But, what about you, he asked. Margaret gave a small shrug. I'll manage. The man slowly took the $20 bill, still looking stunned. Thank you, he said softly. Then he looked back at her with something different in his expression now. Not just relief. Gratitude. Deep, genuine gratitude. I swear I'll return it, he said. If you could just give me your name. Margaret shook her head lightly. That's not necessary. The man frowned slightly. But how will I? She smiled faintly. Just promise me one thing. What's that? Margaret tucked her purse under her arm again. If you ever see someone else who needs help, she said gently, do the same thing for them. The man looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. I will. Neither of them knew it yet. But that simple moment, in the middle of a winter storm, was about to change both of their lives forever. The man stood there for a few seconds after taking the money, as if the moment hadn't fully registered yet. Snow swirled between them, catching in the yellow glow of the bus stop light. Margaret had already stepped back into the shelter, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. Without the money in her purse, something inside her felt strangely lighter, and heavier at the same time. The man looked down at the $20 bill again. You really didn't have to do that, he said quietly. Margaret gave a small, tired smile. Maybe not, she replied. But sometimes people need help. The man nodded slowly. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to say more. Like there were words stuck somewhere behind his expression that he hadn't quite figured out how to release yet. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a small notebook. Margaret watched with mild curiosity. The pages looked worn, slightly bent at the corners from use. He flipped it open and pulled a pen from his pocket. At least let me write something down, he said. Margaret tilted her head. What for? My name, he replied. And a way to contact me. Margaret shook her head again, more gently this time. That's not necessary. The man paused mid-motion. You're just going to trust a stranger in a snowstorm with your last $20, he asked. Margaret chuckled softly. Well, it's too late to take it back now. That earned a faint smile from him. But he didn't put the notebook away. Please, he said. I insist. Margaret studied his face again. The exhaustion was still there. So was the cold. But now there was something else too. A seriousness. Finally she sighed. All right, she said. If it makes you feel better. The man quickly scribbled something down on the page, tore it out, and held it toward her. She took the paper. The ink had slightly smudged from the damp air. All it said was, Jonathan Reeves. And beneath it, a phone number. Margaret folded the paper and tucked it into her purse without thinking too much about it. Thank you, he said again. Then he glanced down the road. Through the snow, headlights suddenly appeared in the distance. A taxi. Margaret noticed it at the same time. Well, she said softly, looks like your ride. The taxi slowed as it approached the corner, its tires crunching through the snow-covered street. The driver leaned over slightly as the window rolled down. You call for a pickup? He asked Jonathan. Jonathan nodded. Yes. The driver gestured toward the back seat. Hop in. Storm's only getting worse. Jonathan hesitated before moving. He looked back at Margaret. The moment stretched quietly between them. You saved me tonight, he said. Margaret shook her head lightly. I just gave you a taxi ride. No, he replied. His voice carried a quiet weight to it now. You did more than that. Margaret didn't know what to say to that. So she simply smiled again. Jonathan opened the taxi door but paused one last time. Margaret, right? He asked. She blinked. I don't remember telling you my name. You didn't, he said. He nodded toward the name tag clipped to her coat from work. She laughed softly. Well, I guess that solves that mystery. Jonathan stepped into the taxi. The door closed with a dull thud. Before the driver pulled away, Jonathan rolled down the window again. Snow blew into the car immediately. Take care of yourself, he called out. You too, Margaret replied. Then the taxi pulled away, disappearing slowly into the swirling white storm. Margaret stood there for another moment, watching the taillights fade. Then the cold wind pushed her back into the shelter again. She checked the bus display. Still delayed. She sighed and sat down on the cold metal bench. Without realizing it, her hand reached into her purse and touched the folded paper again. Jonathan Reeves. She stared at the name for a second. Then she shook her head and slipped the purse closed. Nice man, she murmured to herself. But I doubt I'll ever see him again. Outside, the storm continued to roar across the empty streets. About 15 minutes later, the bus finally arrived. The doors opened with a long hiss of air. Margaret climbed aboard. The driver looked at her through the mirror. Rough night out there, he said. You could say that, Margaret replied. She tapped her bus pass and moved toward the back of the nearly empty bus. The heater hummed softly as the vehicle pulled away from the curb. Through the frosted window, Margaret watched the snow-covered city slide past. Her stomach growled quietly. She smiled to herself. Well, she whispered, guess tomorrow will be interesting. But strangely, she didn't regret what she had done. Not even a little. Across town, meanwhile, the taxi carrying Jonathan Reeves sped down the icy road. Jonathan leaned back in the seat, staring at the $20 bill still in his hand. The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror. Someone helped you out tonight? The driver asked. Jonathan nodded slowly. Yes. Friend of yours? Jonathan looked out the window at the storm. No, he said quietly. A stranger. He folded the bill carefully and slipped it into his wallet. Then he added something so softly the driver almost didn't hear it. But not for long. The next morning arrived quietly. The storm had passed sometime before dawn, leaving the city covered in a thick blanket of white. Snow clung to rooftops, buried sidewalks, and turned parked cars into smooth, rounded shapes that barely looked like vehicles anymore. Inside her small apartment above the laundromat, Margaret Hale stood in her kitchen, watching the morning light reflect off the snowy street below. The radiator hummed softly against the wall. Her apartment was modest, just a narrow living room, a tiny kitchen, and a bedroom barely large enough for her bed and dresser. But it was clean, warm, and familiar. Margaret wrapped both hands around a mug of hot tea. She had slept surprisingly well. Somehow the storm had felt peaceful once she was finally home. Still, as she opened her purse that morning, reality returned quickly. Inside were the same things as yesterday. Her keys. Her bus pass. The small folded paper with Jonathan Reeves' name. But one thing was missing. The $20. Margaret stared at the empty space in her wallet for a moment. Well, she sighed softly. I suppose breakfast will be simple today. She opened the cupboard and found half a loaf of bread. Enough for toast. The refrigerator held little more than a jar of jam and a carton of milk that was almost empty. It would have to do. Margaret toasted 2 slices of bread and spread them with the last bit of jam. Then she sat at the small kitchen table by the window. Outside, a few people were already shoveling sidewalks. Life moving forward again. Margaret took a bite of toast. She didn't feel regret. But she did feel the quiet weight of uncertainty. Payday wasn't until Friday. And today was only Tuesday. She glanced at the folded paper again. Jonathan Reeves. The name meant nothing to her. For a brief moment she wondered if she should call the number. Then she shook her head. No, she murmured. He had already thanked her. That was enough. She folded the paper again and tucked it back into her purse. Across town, at the exact same moment, Jonathan Reeves was standing inside a very different kitchen. Sunlight poured through enormous glass windows overlooking the city skyline. The floors were polished marble. The counters were black granite. And the kitchen itself was larger than Margaret's entire apartment. Jonathan stood beside a Long Island counter, holding a cup of coffee in one hand. He hadn't slept much. The events of the previous night kept replaying in his mind. The storm. The broken car. The freezing walk through the snow. And the woman at the bus stop. Margaret. His assistant, Clara, entered the kitchen carrying a tablet. You're up early, she said. Jonathan didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached into his wallet and pulled out the folded $20 bill. Clara noticed it immediately. That's unusual, she said. I don't think I've ever seen you carry cash. Jonathan gave a small smile. I usually don't. He placed the bill carefully on the counter. Clara glanced down at it, confused. So why the sudden interest in $20? Jonathan leaned back against the counter. Because last night, he said quietly, this $20 was the only thing standing between me and spending the night in a snowstorm. Clara raised an eyebrow. You're serious? Jonathan nodded. My car died about 2 miles from downtown. Phone battery was dead. And the storm was worse than the forecast. And someone helped you? Jonathan nodded again. A woman at a bus stop. Clara crossed her arms. Let me guess. You already sent her flowers, a gift card, and a thank you letter. Jonathan shook his head slowly. No. Clara frowned. Why not? Jonathan looked at the bill again. Because she didn't give me this expecting anything in return. Clara tilted her head slightly. Most people still appreciate being thanked. Jonathan smiled faintly. Oh, I intend to thank her. He slid the bill back into his wallet. But first, I want to know who she is. Clara's eyes narrowed with curiosity. That sounds mysterious. Jonathan picked up his coat from the chair. I have her name. Margaret Hale. Clara tapped quickly on her tablet. In this city, that could be dozens of people. Jonathan nodded. Then we start looking. Clara studied him for a moment. You're serious about this? Jonathan walked toward the door. Clara, he said calmly, that woman gave a stranger her last $20 in the middle of a snowstorm. He paused at the doorway. People like that don't come along very often. Clara smiled slightly. So what exactly are you planning to do when you find her? Jonathan opened the door and stepped out. His answer came with a quiet certainty. You'll see. Across the city, Margaret had already left her apartment for work, unaware that the small act of kindness she had almost forgotten had just become the most important thing in someone else's day. And before the week was over, it would change her life forever. Wednesday passed slowly for Margaret. The storm had left the sidewalks covered in uneven piles of gray snow, and every step on her walk to work felt careful and deliberate. The air was still cold, though the wind had finally calmed. Margaret arrived at the insurance building just before 6 in the evening, the same way she did every weekday. The lobby smelled faintly of floor polish and coffee from the small machine near the reception desk. Most of the office workers had already gone home for the day. Only the security guard remained. "Evening, Margaret," he said with a friendly nod. "Evening, Tom," she replied. Tom had been the building's night guard for years. They didn't talk much, but after seeing each other almost every night for so long, they had settled into a comfortable routine. Margaret signed the cleaning log and took the elevator up to the 4th floor. The doors opened with a soft chime. Rows of quiet desks stretched across the office. Computer screens were dark. Chairs pushed neatly under tables. Margaret set her bag down in the supply closet and began her usual routine. Trash cans first. Then wiping desks. Then vacuuming the carpeted hallways. It was simple work. Quiet work. The kind that gave her time to think. But that evening, something unexpected happened. About an hour into her shift, Margaret noticed someone standing in the hallway near the elevator. She paused mid-step. That was unusual. No one was normally here this late. The man standing there was dressed in a dark suit and overcoat, snow still clinging lightly to his shoulders. He looked slightly out of place in the quiet office floor. Margaret approached carefully. "Can I help you?" she asked politely. The man turned. He looked relieved to see someone. "Yes, actually," he said. "I'm looking for someone who works here." Margaret wiped her hands on the cloth she was holding. "Most people have already gone home." The man nodded. "I figured." He glanced at a small notebook in his hand. "Do you know someone named Margaret Hale?" Margaret blinked. "That's me." The man's face brightened slightly. "Oh good. I was hoping I found the right place." Margaret tilted her head. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" The man smiled politely. "No, ma'am. My name is David Chen. I work for Mr. Jonathan Reeves." Margaret froze slightly. The name sounded familiar. Jonathan Reeves. Then it clicked. The paper in her purse. The man from the bus stop. Margaret stared at him for a moment. "The man from the snowstorm?" she said slowly. David nodded. "Yes." Margaret felt a strange mixture of surprise and confusion. "Oh, well. I didn't expect." David raised a hand gently. "Mr. Reeves wanted to meet you personally." Margaret frowned slightly. "That really isn't necessary." David smiled. "He insisted." Margaret hesitated. "I only helped him get a taxi." "Yes," David replied. "And that's exactly why he wants to meet you." Margaret leaned slightly on the handle of her mop. "I'm working right now." "That's fine," David said. "Mr. Reeves asked if you might be willing to join him for lunch tomorrow." Margaret blinked again. "Lunch?" David nodded. "At his office." Margaret almost laughed. "You're serious?" "Yes." She shook her head. "That's very kind of him, but it really isn't necessary." David's smile remained patient. "I understand how this might feel unusual." Margaret crossed her arms slightly. A little. David reached into his coat pocket and carefully pulled out an envelope. This might help explain. He handed it to her. Margaret hesitated before taking it. The envelope felt thick. Inside was a small card. Printed in elegant lettering. Jonathan Reeves. Reeves Global Industries ***. Margaret looked up slowly. Industries? David nodded. Mr. Reeves is the founder. Margaret stared at the card. Something about the name suddenly sounded much bigger than she had realized. She looked back at David. You mean, he owns a company? David smiled gently. He owns several. Margaret's mind struggled to catch up with the new information. The man she had given $20 to wasn't just someone stranded in the snow. He was. Well, David continued calmly, Mr. Reeves would really appreciate the chance to thank you properly. Margaret looked down at the card again. Then at the envelope. Then back at David. Her first instinct was still to refuse. But curiosity had quietly started to grow. Lunch, she repeated slowly. David nodded. Tomorrow. Margaret sighed. Well. She thought about it for a moment. All right, she said finally. But only because he seems very determined. David smiled. He is. Margaret placed the card carefully into her pocket. She still had no idea that the small act of kindness she had nearly forgotten was about to open a door she never imagined walking through. And tomorrow, everything was going to change. The next day felt strangely different from the moment Margaret woke up. Not dramatically different. Her small apartment looked exactly the same as it had the day before. The radiator still clicked softly against the wall. The laundromat machines downstairs still hummed faintly through the floor. But something about the morning carried a quiet sense of anticipation. Margaret stood in front of her closet longer than usual. Most of her clothes were simple and practical, warm sweaters, comfortable shoes, and coats that had lasted many winters. She finally chose a soft gray cardigan and her cleanest pair of slacks. Lunch, she murmured to herself. The word still sounded strange. It had been years since anyone had invited her to lunch downtown. By 11:30 she was already on the bus. The city looked different without the storm. Snowbanks lined the streets, but the sky was clear and bright. Sunlight bounced off the frozen sidewalks and filled the air with a sharp winter glow. Margaret clutched the small envelope David had given her the night before. Inside was the address to Reeves Global Industries. She had looked it up briefly that morning. The building alone was 30 stories tall. Margaret had almost changed her mind after seeing that. But curiosity had pushed her forward. 20 minutes later, the bus stopped near the center of downtown. Margaret stepped off and looked up. The building towered above her. Glass and steel stretched high into the sky, reflecting clouds like a mirror. She stood there for a moment, feeling very small. Well, she whispered softly. No turning back now. Inside, the lobby was enormous. Polished marble floors gleamed under tall ceiling lights. People in suits walked briskly across the room while security guards stood behind a wide front desk. Margaret approached carefully. A young receptionist looked up and smiled politely. Good afternoon. Margaret cleared her throat slightly. Hello. I believe I'm here to see Mr. Jonathan Reeves. The receptionist glanced at her computer. Your name? Margaret Hale. The receptionist's expression brightened instantly. Of course, Ms. Hale. Mr. Reeves has been expecting you. Margaret blinked. Expecting me? Yes. The receptionist pressed a small button. Mr. Reeves' assistant will be right down. Margaret stood quietly near the desk, feeling slightly out of place among the polished shoes and business suits around her. Within a minute, a woman stepped out of the elevator and approached. She was elegant, professional, and instantly recognizable from Jonathan's description. "Margaret?" she asked warmly. Margaret nodded. "Yes." The woman extended her hand. "I'm Clara. Mr. Reeves asked me to bring you up." Margaret shook her hand gently. "Nice to meet you." They walked together toward the elevators. As the doors closed and the elevator began rising, Margaret felt her stomach flutter slightly. Clara noticed. "Nervous?" she asked kindly. Margaret laughed softly. "A little." "That's understandable." The elevator stopped on the top floor. When the doors opened, Margaret stepped into a quiet hallway lined with tall windows overlooking the entire city. The view alone nearly stopped her in place. Cars looked like tiny moving dots below. Snow-covered rooftops stretched out in every direction. Clara led her down the hall toward a large office door. She knocked lightly. A familiar voice answered from inside. "Come in." Clara opened the door. Jonathan Reeves stood near the window, sunlight shining across the room behind him. He looked exactly as Margaret remembered from the bus stop, though now his coat was gone, replaced with a neatly pressed suit. When he saw her, his face lit with genuine recognition. "Margaret." Margaret smiled slightly. "Hello again." Jonathan stepped forward and extended his hand. "I'm very glad you came." Margaret shook it. "You seemed very determined." Jonathan chuckled. "That's true." Clara quietly slipped out of the room, closing the door behind her. Jonathan gestured toward a small table near the window where lunch had already been set. "Please," he said. "Sit." Margaret sat carefully. The view behind him was still breathtaking. Jonathan noticed her looking out at the skyline. "It's quite something, isn't it?" Margaret nodded slowly. "I've never seen the city from up here." Jonathan sat across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jonathan reached into his wallet and carefully placed something on the table. The same $20 bill. Margaret recognized it immediately. "You kept it," she said. Jonathan nodded. "I will always keep it." Margaret tilted her head. "That seems unnecessary." Jonathan leaned forward slightly. "No," he said quietly. "It isn't." Margaret studied him with curiosity. "You've gone through a lot of effort over $20. Jonathan smiled faintly. "It was never about the money." Margaret folded her hands. "Then what was it about?" Jonathan looked directly at her. "That night, dozens of people walked past me while I was trying to get help." Margaret listened quietly. "They saw a stranger in trouble," he continued. "And they kept walking." He gestured toward the bill. "But you didn't." Margaret shrugged gently. "You looked cold." Jonathan laughed softly. "I was freezing." "But still," he said, his voice becoming more thoughtful, "you gave me the last money you had." Margaret blinked slightly. "You knew?" Jonathan nodded. "You thought I didn't notice." Margaret looked down at the table for a moment. "Well, it wasn't a big deal." Jonathan leaned back slightly in his chair. "Margaret," he said calmly. "For you, maybe not. But for me." He paused. "It changed something." Margaret looked up again. "What do you mean?" Jonathan smiled. "You reminded me that kindness still exists in the world." Margaret didn't know what to say to that. Jonathan reached into a folder beside him and slid something across the table. A document. Margaret looked at it carefully. Then her eyes widened. Because the paper wasn't just a thank you note. It was something far bigger. Something she never expected. And suddenly, Margaret realized that the lunch she thought was simply a thank you was actually the beginning of something much larger. Margaret stared at the document for several long seconds. At first, she thought she must be misunderstanding what she was reading. The words on the page were printed neatly and clearly, but they didn't seem to belong in her life. She slowly lifted her eyes back to Jonathan. "I think," she said carefully, "you might have given me the wrong paper." Jonathan shook his head gently. "No," he said. "That one is for you." Margaret looked down again. At the top of the page were the words, "Community Support Initiative, Director Position." Beneath it was a short description. A foundation. A program designed to help people who were struggling during harsh winters, people who couldn't afford heating, food, or emergency transportation. Margaret frowned slightly. "I don't understand." Jonathan leaned forward, folding his hands. "After that night," he explained, "I started thinking about something." Margaret waited. "I run several companies," he continued. "We build technology, manage investments, and support large business projects all over the country." Margaret nodded slowly. "But somewhere along the way," Jonathan said, "I realized I had stopped noticing the small problems people face every day." He tapped lightly on the $20 bill still resting on the table. "That night reminded me." Margaret listened quietly. "There are thousands of people in this city," Jonathan said, "who face the same kind of situation I faced in that storm. Broken cars. No money for a ride. No safe way home." Margaret thought back to the bus stop. The wind. The cold. "Yes," she said softly. Jonathan slid the document a little closer to her. "So I decided to start something new." Margaret glanced at the paper again. "A foundation?" "Yes." Jonathan nodded. "We're calling it the Winter Bridge Program." Margaret read the description again. Emergency transportation. Heating assistance. Food vouchers during severe storms. Help for people who fall through the cracks. Her eyes widened slightly. "This is a lot." Jonathan smiled. "It is." Margaret looked back up. "But what does this have to do with me?" Jonathan's answer came without hesitation. "Everything." Margaret blinked. "I'm not a businesswoman." "I know. I don't run organizations." "I know." Margaret gestured lightly toward the paper. "So why would you want me involved in this?" Jonathan leaned back in his chair. "Because this program started with you." Margaret shook her head. "No, it didn't. It started with your idea." Jonathan smiled faintly. "No," he said. "It started with your kindness." The room grew quiet. Margaret stared out the window for a moment, looking at the snowy city far below. Cars moved slowly along the streets. People walked along sidewalks bundled in heavy coats. Just ordinary lives continuing. Jonathan spoke again. "This foundation is going to help thousands of people." Margaret looked back at him. "That's wonderful. And I want someone guiding it who understands what it means to struggle," he continued. Margaret laughed softly. "Well, I certainly qualify for that." Jonathan smiled. "That's exactly my point." He tapped the document again. "The position listed there is not complicated." Margaret glanced down again. Community Director, Winter Bridge Program. Flexible hours. Community outreach. Helping identify people in need. Her eyes paused on one more line. Annual salary, $65,000. Margaret's breath caught slightly. "That can't be right." Jonathan nodded. "It is." Margaret stared at him. "That's more money than I've ever made in my life." Jonathan's voice softened. "Then it's about time that changed." Margaret sat back slowly. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. Her mind drifted back to the storm again. To the cold bus stop. To the simple moment when she had taken a $20 bill out of her purse. You did all of this, she said slowly, because of that night? Jonathan shook his head gently. No. Margaret frowned slightly. No? I did it because of what that night reminded me, he said. Margaret studied him. And what was that? Jonathan smiled. That the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. Margaret looked down at the paper again. Her hands rested on the table beside it. You really believe I could do this? Jonathan didn't hesitate. I do. Margaret thought about her quiet apartment. Her long cleaning shifts. Her careful grocery budgets. Then she looked back out at the city. Maybe, just maybe, her life wasn't finished surprising her yet. Finally she picked up the document. Well, she said softly. I suppose helping people stay warm during winter sounds like meaningful work. Jonathan smiled broadly. I think you'll be very good at it. Margaret chuckled lightly. All this, she said, holding up the paper slightly, because of $20. Jonathan glanced at the bill again. No, he said. Because of the heart behind it. Outside the tall windows, sunlight reflected across the snow-covered city. And somewhere below, people hurried through their ordinary days. Unaware that a simple act of kindness during a snowstorm had just created something that would help countless strangers for years to come. Because sometimes, the smallest gift you give a stranger comes back as a bridge that changes your entire life.